My name is James Lawrenson. I'm the Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute. Before we start proceedings tonight, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the E&OE Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands upon which UTS's city campus stands. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional owners of this land and custodians of knowledge for this land. Welcome to UTS students, staff and all friends of UTS ACRI. Just to briefly introduce our institute, when I became Director of ACRI in April 2019, I put in place a very simple mission, and that is I see our aim, our job, as being to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. That's what we're all about. We aren't a think tank with a particular agenda to push. We're not aligned to government, reciting government talking points. We're a bunch of academics, but we don't just aim to communicate within universities. We do take our external engagement very seriously. That's really central to UTS's own ethos, and we're certainly keen to be a part of that. Fundamentally, what we're about is uncovering the facts and evidence that we can pass on to decision makers in government, in industry, in civil society, so that they can make better decisions themselves in their China engagement. Well, tonight's event is timed to coincide with the beginning of the year of the ox. We're just a couple weeks into it. And for Australia-China relations, what a year the year of the rat was. It wasn't a positive one. Let's address the elephant in the room. It was a tough year across the board. Of course, political relations between Beijing and Canberra. I think they started the year at a low since diplomatic ties were established in 1972. And then we kept plumbing new lows throughout the year. As an economist, what stood out to me was 2020 really was the year that the political tensions spilled over into the economic realm. That was new, and it was quite dramatic just to the extent to which that happened. Most memorable for me was an example in December, just a few months ago, when the Global Times reported. Global Times, obviously a favourite source of comment for many Australian journalists because they're very big on headlines and bold claims. And one thing they reported was that China's National Development and Reform Commission had approved Chinese power plants to import coal from overseas. Sounds good, but, open quotes, without restrictions, comma, except for Australia, close quote. That's pretty brazen in a way that we haven't seen previously. And then, of course, apart from the geopolitics and the economics, there's been blowback for people-to-people ties as well. And perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, Chinese Australians, Australia's own Chinese communities as well. So look, we've got a fabulous panel here to discuss these issues tonight. And I think what I'm most excited about when it comes to this panel is the breadth of coverage our three panellists are able to comment on. So let me very briefly introduce them to you, sorry, and then we'll get started with some questions. Let me start with Richard Maude in the middle. Richard Maude is the Executive Director, Policy of Asia Society Australia. Richard, you've been in that role since the beginning of 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Prior to that, you come with extensive public service experience, most recently in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where you headed up the Indo-Pacific Division in DFAT. And before that, of course, as Director General of the Office of National Assessments. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, James.
To my immediate left, we have Professor Wanning Sun. If you're from an academic background, you'll know Wanning's work. She's Australia's foremost academic expert on transnational and diasporic Chinese media. That's not all. She's also published on issues related to rural to urban migration in China and on social inequality issues in China. And in recognition of Wanning's stellar research performance in 2016, there we go. In 2016, she was elected as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. a hall of fame, if you like, for Australian academics in the humanities. And more recently, she's been publishing specifically on this issue of Australian media coverage of China and actively participating in the commentary space on these issues. At the end, we have Mike Smith. Mike Smith, folks, is Australia's last correspondent in China. Now, that's not just a reference to the fact that he was rushed home in September last year, out of concerns that his safety might be in jeopardy. It also refers to the title of his upcoming book coming out in June. Mike, we're going to get you back, I hope, to discuss that book.
That'll be great, James. Thanks.
He's been the AFR's China correspondent since 2017, but actually, Mike, your career in the China space goes back a lot further than that. In the lead up to 1997, the Hong Kong handover, you were in fact the chief political correspondent way back then.
That's right. Yeah, I moved to Hong Kong in 1993 when I was very young, straight from my budding career in Hobart, Tasmania, and worked in Hong Kong and covered the handover. It was a pretty exciting time.
Hobart to Hong Kong.
Yes.
I hope that's in your book.
It was a bit of a culture shock.
Okay, let's get started, folks. Welcome to you all. Look, towards the end of last year, I asked the ACRI advisory board, a group of people with extensive experience in China engagement from public policy backgrounds, journalism backgrounds, business backgrounds, what they thought the key issues in the Australia-China relationship were that ACRI should focus some attention on. And it was interesting to me that rather than talking about the geopolitics and the economics, which tends to occupy the front pages of our newspapers, what they said that we really desperately need some attention on was the people-to-people links. And in particular, the situation Chinese Australians currently find themselves in, Australia's own Chinese communities. So look, rather than geopolitics and economics, we'll get to those, but for now, let's start off with this issue of people-to-people ties. Richard, can I start with you on this one? The pressures facing people-to-people ties, Chinese Australians, to me, seems to have spiked alongside concerns in Australia around the challenge of foreign interference. Now, on the one hand, diaspora communities are prime targets for foreign interference. That is, a foreign government would be quite keen to use their diaspora, perhaps through co-opting them or perhaps through coercing them, either way, to further their interests. Now, just to be clear though, on the other hand, just because they're targets of foreign interference, that obviously doesn't mean they're necessarily amenable to it. We don't want to go around casting aspersions on the loyalties of Chinese Australians just on the basis that they're a target. But what I wanted to ask you, Richard, I know your most recent assignment was in DFAT, not Home Affairs. But can I draw some thoughts out from you on this challenge? Australia's experienced waves of migration for plenty of countries around the world. For the last 4 years, India has actually been our most prominent source of immigration. Now, I imagine all of these countries from which our immigration waves have come, plenty of these countries' governments would have an interest in drawing on their diaspora. Is China any different? And if so, how? I think we sometimes hear this from the Chinese government and from some Australian commentators as well, that our concerns about Chinese government interference actually borders on Sinophobia. What's your take, Richard?
Well, thanks, James. Before I have a crack at that question, just let me say thank you again to you and to UTS for inviting me here tonight. It's also really good to be speaking to a live audience, even though you are strangely separated from up here. This is only the second time in a year that I've spoken in front of a live audience. And having spent 30 years living on aeroplanes, I got on a plane this morning for the first time in 12 months. I thought it might be exciting again, but I actually fell asleep on the plane because it was quite early. So let me have a go at your question. I think the short answer to your question is that yes, I think China is different. There is something really quite different going on here. And of course, you're absolutely right that any country that has a large diaspora in another country would automatically look at that diaspora and see a potential source of soft power and influence. I'm sure the Indian government does for its Indian communities the world over, and indeed, of course, Australia does for its own very extensive diaspora, reduced in COVID now as they come home. But I do think there's something different here. I really think you cannot take the party state out of the equation when you think about the pressure that the diaspora is under, the Chinese community is under here. In Australia, as you know, James, as our panel knows, and I'm sure all the audience knows, President Xi has placed an extremely high emphasis on reinforcing the ideological foundations of the party. It's what they call the importance of ideological security, and he sees this as essential to the party's longevity. And that drive for ideological security manifests itself in many ways, and among them are a very strong desire to control the narrative about China, so to tell the story about China so that there's really only one truth about China, and that's the party's truth. And of course also to silence or crowd out or drown out or intimidate critics of the party, or really any criticism of the party. And, you know, these days that comes with a hefty dose of nationalism, and also a pretty authoritarian system with very strong digital tools at its disposal. So the problem for Australia and for overseas Chinese communities is that that drive for ideological security doesn't have any borders. It has no boundaries. And the party increasingly is very comfortable in reaching right into other countries to attempt to do those things I talked about, to control the narratives, to stifle criticism. And of course, you know, that's very prominent on issues like Taiwan or Hong Kong or Tibet, Xinjiang, but increasingly it's a broad range of issues, South China Sea, even the pandemic. And we see that very strongly in Australia. And I think here, it's really, really important for the rest of Australia to recognise the pressure that this can place members of the Chinese Australian community under. There's a very, you know, potentially high price to pay for going against the party or non-compliance if you're a business in Australia, or if you're a Chinese Australian with relatives back home. So we as a nation should have a great deal of empathy for that. We should recognise it, and we should certainly, absolutely not set, you know, false tests of loyalty for the Australian Chinese community. So look, I think that's one problem. There's a separate problem, and I think you do need to separate it out, which is attempts by the party sometimes to use Chinese Australians to directly interfere in Australian politics in a covert way. And the government distinguishes between influence and interference deliberately. That's also a problem, and where it occurs, we should try and stamp it out. But we shouldn't, as you said, we should not rush to judgment about these things. It's very easy to point the finger. And where a case might be proved, we should be clear that the actions of a very small number of people do not represent the community.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so a takeaway there is we are dealing with something different here that doesn't apply necessarily in other contexts. This drive for ideological security that comes out of China and that can sometimes reach right here into Australia. Wanning, can I go to you next? Foreign interference can obviously take many different forms. Richard's mentioned a couple of them. There does seem to me to frequently be an assumption that Chinese Australians are particularly vulnerable. And I don't actually mean as targets. What I mean is that they might actually be inclined to help the Chinese government achieve its objectives. Now, I think this assumption applies particularly to more recent migrants from mainland China. People might say, for example, that more recent migrants have been through a schooling system that's emphasised patriotic education. WeChat might be their primary source of news, censored news, I should say. And indeed, we've seen some pretty plain statements of this assumption in the past. I mean, I think in particular of a commentary piece from Peter Harcher, the Sydney Morning Herald's international editor, where he argued that we should take more migrants from Hong Kong and Taiwan because, let me get this quote right, quote, they are more likely to value Australian liberties, close quote. So, Wanning, you've studied these communities, you've studied WeChat quite extensively. So what are the key assumptions that you see often being made about Chinese Australians? Are they correct? And if they're not, what are the consequences of us continuing to make these same assumptions?
Well, James, that is a very, very important question. I don't think we have enough time to talk about what are the assumptions. So let me just perhaps focus on the assumptions that from my point of view are not correct. Right. Let's see if we can work through some of them. But I have to say that even though I'm a member of the so-called Chinese community, I can't claim to speak on behalf of them. And I think the greatest fear of the Chinese community is to be represented. I'm not here to represent them. And I'll try my best to base my statement on the research I do. Now, but just coming back to your question about what are some of the assumptions that are not correct. And at first I would say, to start with, it's easy for us to use the shorthand word Chinese Australia community. But there is no such a thing as Australian Chinese community or Chinese Australian community. It is 1.2 million people, extremely diverse in terms of origin, in terms of language group, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of political affiliation, in terms of the relationship to China. Some have never been to China at all. So that's very, very diverse. But we continue to use this word, Chinese Australian community, sometimes plural, sometimes single, right? So that's the first assumption. The second one that I think is, you touched on the fact that particularly for the mainland PRC, Mandarin speaking first generation migration, there's tend to be this assumption that, well, there's only two ways of dividing them, and that's pro-China and then against China, right? So they're either, so whereas from I can see the people I talk to and I do research on, the great majority of the people do not belong to either of these categories, and they are in the middle. They are the silent majority, and they are in the middle. They do not wish to be identified as pro-China or against China. So that's another assumption. The third one is like the assumption is that they're not capable of loving China and Australia at the same time. And as a result of that, they are expected to make a choice, right? And so that is, the reality is that people are far more capable of entertaining ambivalent feelings about their own motherland, about the country of their residence. And the sense of belonging is very complex than just, I hate it or I like it. So that's another assumption that's problematic. You talked about WeChat. WeChat is deeply, deeply contested. We all know WeChat is subject to the Chinese government's control and is subject to censorship, right? And anything you said that's politically sensitive or unpalatable, we get deleted. Now, because of that, there is this assumption that the people, Chinese migrants in Australia, because WeChat is their main social media platform, they must be accessing nothing but Chinese propaganda, whereas the reality is that that's not true. The WeChat is used by the people like myself and my friends and the people I study to access a wide range of materials, including, Sydney Morning Herald, the Australians, the ABCs, and New York Times, everything. They use WeChat to post, to share, and to comment on materials all over the world. Now, still on WeChat, WeChat is censored. So this assumption is that because it's censored, nothing good can come out of this. So we should ban it because it's sort of threat to national security. Whereas in fact, there's still no evidence to show there is actually a threat to national security. Whereas there's a lot of evidence to show that WeChat has been used to promote all sorts of good citizenship practices, such as raise donations for the bushfire victims, such as to raise donations to donate masks for the participants who want to protest in the Black Lives Matter movement, and to get together and to sort of figure out how to sort of engage in community activities. So that WeChat, it can be used in a kind of very, very positive way too, despite the fact it's controlled. And the next one is because they come from China, they grew up from the Chinese system, they must be easily brainwashed and swayed by Chinese propaganda. Now, that is nothing actually could be further away from the truth. These are the people who grew up in China who are trained from the word go to learn to read oppositionally, right? They're far better than you guys sitting here than actually how to decode Chinese propaganda, right? So there's this kind of assumption, oh, they use WeChat, they only get Chinese propaganda, they must be under the thumbs of the Chinese government. That's just totally not true. Now, they also have this kind of assumption that when they express pro-Chinese sentiment, they must be because they are doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party. There cannot be the possibility that nationalism, pro-Chinese nationalism, can be spontaneous or voluntary. And sometimes it could be a result of the fact they're just really not happy with the way they're portrayed in Australia. So there's a push and a pull factor as well. Now, I won't go on too long, but the last thing I want to say is that because there's in a business sector, economists, we're talking about Chinese business people, there is this kind of assumption that, oh, there's a lot of language barriers, so they only do business with their own communities, and they only use Guanxi, and Guanxi is a big deal, and this kind of silo there. Whereas, the report produced by Dr. Lee in Sydney University and KPMG has made it very clear that the young first-generation Chinese migrant entrepreneurs are very capable of making connections with the Australian business, with the business in China, and transnationally. So I think that the last one I want to say is this assumption that if you are anti-CCP, if there are some people who live in Australia are against the CCP or critical of Chinese CCP, then they must be very pro-democratic, independent thinking people. Yeah, that could be the case, but not always the case. You only have to read an article written by, what's his name, Cass Ross, that was published in the Interpreter a few days ago to see that there's evidence about how the far right uses the anti-Chinese sentiment to push their sort of anti-right agenda. So yeah, I'll just stop there because there is a lot. But the question about what is the consequence or ramification of this, it is quite serious, as Richard has already alluded to. And there is a high risk of alienating this community and making them feel that they don't belong. And even though they are citizens in this country and they have just as much as right as everybody else. So, so it's almost like they're treated as the internal other, right? In that case, that's not good for social cohesion. We're a multicultural society, right? Yeah. So, and it's worst problem with this kind of marginalization is that it's not good from government point of view. It's not good for public diplomacy, right? We should actually use the Chinese people, migrant here, to push Australia's public diplomacy agenda, whereas rather than actually pushing them away from us, so that actually China seems more appealing to them, right? So I think that's just really quite unfortunate. I'll stop.
Gee, Wanning, I asked, are we getting any assumptions wrong here?
You've asked, so you got me started.
It's pretty clear that we are, and it's not just one or two. That's quite a devastating list of assumptions that we're making, and we're not getting. And
I'm only giving you the top 10.
Right. Okay, we'll get you back. Mike, can I go over to you? Mike, I thought I'd ask you as probably the person on the panel who's most recently been on the ground in China. You're living in Shanghai, obviously, for 3 years, only just back in September. to get a bit of the different perspective on Australia's diaspora community in China. Now, I know it's not as large as the Chinese diaspora in Australia, but they're in the firing line of this a bit as well. I mean, I think of DFAT's upgraded travel advice, which warned that Australians may also be at risk of arbitrary detention, for example. It's a stark observation that there's 2 Australians detained in China at the moment, facing national security charges. A pretty dire situation in both cases. They were both born in China, but they're Australian citizens. On the other hand, I've been reading your reporting. I remember one from last October where you spoke to Heidi Duggan, and she wasn't nervous about returning to China at all. In fact, she couldn't wait. And there was another report on the ABC's 7:30 where they interviewed Australian business people in Shanghai, and they were saying, no, we don't feel threatened at all. This is all going really well. So what's your assessment of how Australia's diaspora in China are faring during this period?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 ways to look at it. I think I'll come back to Changlei and Yanghenzhou later. They're sort of in a different category. But for Australians on the ground in China, I mean, for most of last year and certainly in July where we had that warning about arbitrary detention, I spent a lot of time with Australian business people in Shanghai, and a lot of those people have been, they've lived in China for 20 years. They've given their life to China. They've married Chinese nationals. They certainly don't plan to leave. And a lot of people were sort of quite horrified by this. I mean, I think there's always a risk of arbitrary detention in China. I mean, 2 Canadians were detained more than 18 months ago. I think that risk has been around for a while, but I think most Australians working in business on the ground in China, felt a bit alarmed by these warnings. They still felt relatively safe. I think everyone was a bit unnerved by this. I think everyone's been unnerved by the deterioration in Australia-China relations. I personally think there are more risks than there were before. But you speak to the long time, the Michelle Garneaus and the Peter R. Curls, and they still feel very safe in China. A lot of people doing business there still see it. It's the only sort of big growth market in the world. They still see huge opportunities there. And look, I mean, for me, when I was there almost 3 years, I mean, as an Australian, I never encountered any racism. I never encountered any pushback personally because of the political situation, notwithstanding what happened to me in the end. That was more political. Look, it's probably changed since I left in September. I mean, my friends say that there's a lot more negative reporting about Australian in the Chinese media, so perhaps that's shifted since I left. But then if you look at the other side, we've got Changlei, a journalist from Melbourne who's been detained for 6 months, and you've got the writer Yanghenzhou, still in prison. And look, it's a very bad situation. We're not quite sure why they're there. It's sort of hard to ignore the politics between Australia and China when you're looking at those cases. So I think the risks have increased.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Mike, can I just follow up? One of the things that I often see we do in Australia is that we always focus on, the moves coming from China to us. Well, that's natural. China's a big place. We're smaller in the big scheme of things. But of course, this is a two-way relationship. And we'd be getting it wrong if we thought that it was only Australians suffering from some of the fallout in the deterioration in the bilateral relationship. For example, we know that last June, if I remember correctly, that Australian security agencies raided the homes of 4 Chinese journalists in Australia. We also know that 2 Chinese academics, I know them both, friends of mine, they had their Australian visas revoked towards the end of last year on the advice of security agencies. You wrote in September about prominent Chinese academics who were amongst your sources in China, that they were telling you they felt compelled to cut off their communications with you. Is it now the case that, amongst Chinese citizens, that there's a genuine fears that if they speak up, their Australian visa applications might be blocked? or assessed differently in the future, or that their communications are might be monitored. And this is not actually theoretical. I mean, this is actually on the public record now, right? Whether our security agencies liked it or not, that WeChat communications were being monitored. So what's your sense of how Chinese citizens are feeling in this?
Yeah, I mean, it's all a bit sad, really. It's a bit depressing. The relationships have deteriorated so much and the debate has become so polarized. And I mean, that's what we found with these Chinese academics. You know, they just look, there's just no point in engaging anymore because everything we say is going to be presented in a certain perspective, and the debate has become so unbalanced. You know, in the media and elsewhere. And I think there's a sense that public opinion in Australia has turned against China so dramatically that they felt that they couldn't be heard. And look, I mean, the ASIO raids on the Chinese journalists was interesting because, you know, no one told us about those raids until we got back to Australia. And there's no doubt those raids triggered the actions the Chinese authorities took against myself and Bill Birtle. So we're all sort of mixed up in that. Look, I'm not privy to what ASIO was investigating or what evidence there was, if any, against these people, but it does all feel very political. But we should also make the point as well that you know, these academics and others in Australia, things are going to get pretty tough for them. But at the same time, I don't think they're subject to the same risks that perhaps Bill and I were, where you could be taken off in the middle of the night. Right. And I don't think the risk level, it's a bit hard to compare. We have a different kind of legal system here, but there's clearly, you know, we've got foreign interference laws and there are a couple of cases running. So we've sort of got to keep all that in mind.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, we might move away from people-to-people ties now. And Wanning, thank you for telling me. I've struck out all my references to Australia's Chinese community. So I've got to admit, I've been one of the people who've done that. I won't be doing it in the future.
It's just easy to say it that way.
Yeah. Richard, let's talk geopolitics. I think that's probably what a lot of folks expected we'd be talking about tonight. Now, look, you've been out of the public service for a year, and things certainly got worse in 2020. But you were there when it's pretty clear that Australian government assessments of China shifted in 2000. I would put, you know, it's definitely the second half of 2016. So I wanted to ask you, I'm not asking for any inside info, you're out of the public service, I understand this, but do you think your old colleagues would be surprised by the downward trend last year? And particularly, you know, the flurry of actions that China took on the trade front, which was new. I mean, I've been, you know, studying China's economy for a while, and that was not normal. This is a new phase of China's economic statecraft in the extent, the breadth of those trade disruptions. Or do you think that this was something that your old colleagues would have contemplated well in advance? And in fact, once this more assertive, aggressive Chinese government behaviour started playing out, this may have just confirmed assessments that back in 2016, we were right.
Yeah, great question, James. I can't really speak for the government. Personally, I was a little surprised by the scale and the scope of the retaliation, but not by the fact that there was retaliation and that the relationship began to deteriorate. I mean, there was that period which your team followed closely, which may still be ahead of us, where, you know, every day it seemed like there was another commodity added to the list, and you'd come to grips with that, and then the next day there'd be another one. So the depth of it was a little surprising to me, but not, as I said, the fact there was retaliation, and the government would have been well aware that there are plenty of other examples around our own region, but even further afield into Europe, where the Chinese government has applied economic levers to try and achieve political outcomes. And those case studies, you know, whether it's in Europe or South Korea, you know, they were closely studied, and so everybody knew that that was a possibility. And look, no no government wants to see its trade hurt, and all governments want to, the government wants to try and protect the economic relationship, but not at any cost. And the government felt that there were a series of other national interests that must take priority. I think the government probably also calculated that so long as iron ore wasn't touched, the overall macro effect on the Australian economy would be bearable. And that's not to deny the pain of individual sectors, but I think as an economist, James, you've probably got the data in your head that the actual hit to total GDP has been relatively small. And of course, perhaps ironically, trade to China has held up because the price of iron ore has been so high. I think the government's probably been also heartened that with the exception of a couple of industries where it's really very hard to replace the size of the Chinese market. So wine is an example, rock lobsters is another. With a couple of exceptions, alternate markets are being found. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases at prices comparable to the very valuable Chinese market. The second part of your question was whether China's actions would have confirmed assessments inside Canberra about China's trajectory, the concerns about where China was going. Well, again, I can't speak for the government, but my guess is yes, absolutely. And not just on the risk of a China prepared to use extensive trade measures for coercive purposes, but more generally about what it's like to live with a very powerful now and very assertive China. Well, last year it seemed to ride roughshod just over just about everybody. So, we've got a glimpse, potentially of what the future might be like if we can't find a better form of coexistence with China and a balance of power in the region that protects our interest. I mean, in a way, we've had a bit of a preview of what you might call unconstrained China might look like.
Right. And it's been a pretty concerning take as well. Well, that's interesting. Okay, so the assessments that were made are now being confirmed. It always struck me as odd that with President Trump in the White House, some smart Chinese diplomacy could have made some rapid gains over the last few years. And somehow, in the Chinese system, they didn't manage to pull it off. It's quite extraordinary. Okay, we're going to pivot away from geopolitics now. We're jumping around everywhere, but that's the nature of talents we have on our panel. Wanning, can I go to you? I want to talk about the media space. Then Mike, I'm going to go back to you for more business comment, befitting of your position at the Australian Financial Review. Wanning, in the past, you've been reasonably critical of a good chunk of the Australian media's coverage of China. As you've watched developments over the last year, as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded, did you sense we were starting to see any more sophisticated treatment in the Australian media? Or if not, what are the main hurdles that you're seeing our media sector is just not getting on China?
Well, James, I have to be very careful because I've got a
Mike is very friendly.
a journalist here, so I'm already enough of an enemy to the Australian media. But having said that, I guess the first point I want to make is that media is very, very important for two reasons. First, it really plays a pivotal role in shaping Australian public's knowledge and perception of China and the Chinese people. Like a lot of other specialized areas such as climate change or physical policy, they are specialized areas. It requires expertise. And so unless so most people would actually defer to the media about its coverage of foreign policy or foreign affairs, even though they can be quite critical of the domestic media because they know what's happening. So that's the number reason, the public perception and public knowledge. The second reason why the media is important is because it is actually an important part of the public diplomacy. Public diplomacy by definition is to use media and communications to communicate the country's image and an impression to another country. Now, rather than actually using media to promote public diplomacy, of course, media is separate from the government in Australia, and they do not see their role as to promote government diplomacy, right? But the Chinese people don't get that. They think that ABC is part of the Australian government. Doesn't matter how hard they try to tell them, they still think it's Australia because it's funded by the taxpayers, so it must be like CCTV. So the people in China just think, you know, what you're doing now, what we're seeing now is actually, rather than use media to promote public diplomacy, we're seeing using media to promote what we call the megaphone diplomacy. Whereas the Australian media and the Global Times is trade words and trade insults, right? So that's the word, just you know, that's not really ideal. Now, we currently have, as far as I can see, mainly two kind of narratives going on if you know, consume media. One is the media narrative about Chinese government control, political control, and human rights issues. That's first narrative. And the other narrative is the ongoing issue of Chinese influence and Chinese interference, right? These two are both very important issues, and we should not stop pursuing them. My criticism of the media is not that we have these ongoing parallels of narratives. My criticism is that we seem to get nothing else. And I believe the Australian public is not best served by not getting a wide range of news stories about China. As Richard said, China is one of the most important countries to Australia. And I think the Australian public deserve to know a wide range of things, including, I'll just think over the top of my head, including what is it like for an ordinary Chinese person to be experiencing, for instance, socio-economic inequality in China, especially for rural migrant workers who don't have urban citizenship, right? Or what does the environmental degradation, you know, what's come of it in China now, and what is the implications of continuing going down this track, right? And you know, or just even for Australian public and the community, how are the lifestyle of the middle class in China changing in such a way that we can actually draw some lessons and get some useful knowledge for the Australian business communities who wish to do import and export with China or do business with China? What are the sectors in China that are desperately in need of some foreign expertise and knowledge? All these kind of things that Australian public would probably benefit a lot from knowing. But currently we're not getting much of that because the two other narratives that I mentioned continue to sort of regurgitate themselves, so to speak. Now, in terms of China coverage, as far as I can see, I put them into three kinds, okay? One is China reporting, people like Mike and Bill are doing in China. The other is coverage of China-Australian relationships. The third one is what I call China influence and China interference reporting. And the third category is usually done onshore, so to speak, by the people who may or may not speak Chinese and mostly don't, and may not have been to China and know much about it. So anybody who's got a bit interest to dig a bit of dirt or uncover some evidence can go have a crack at it, right? So I think that the third category is the most problematic so far. So I think, you know, the bottom line is I think it's important to provide comprehensive, in-depth and nuanced reporting with diverse perspectives. Now, but having said that, I'm aware of the fact that there are a wide range of factors that interact to shape the story we get today, right? First of all, is the geopolitics, right? Unless the geopolitical dimension that we have just discussed change, it's very hard to see in the future there is some kind of change of paradigm, right? And the second factor is that after all, Australia is a country that's caught in the middle between China and the US, right? We depend on China so much economically, yet we are allies with the US in terms of security. That is a very uncomfortable position, and that breeds a lot of fear and anxiety, and that's reflected in the media. Now, thirdly, I think economics, like the dollars, let's talk, you know, I think the digital disruption has caused a lot of insecurity on the part of the traditional journalism, right? So as a result of that, there is a lot of need just to, to grow ratings, to engross circulations and sell copies. And so, as a result of that, there is this kind of tendency, not for a lot of media outlets just to become populist, to cater to the great denominator, if you like. And finally, I think in the populist kind of political environment, you need a national enemy. And China is the perfect one. So as a result of that, and I think that, there's a lot of reasons why we have this kind of situation as we have today. But of course, we can talk about raising the standard, lifting the games. We can talk about trying to come up with recommendations for the best practices in journalism. We can talk about having a better code of conduct for journalists. We can talk about, how about stop using weasel words such as being linked to something, or being connected with something, or being seen to have implications or consequences of something like that. Yeah, but at the end of the day, forgive me for not being so optimistic.
That's okay, Wanning. That's not your job to be forced optimistic. And just on the linked word, I just have to echo that sentiment. I think there is no more abused word in Australia's discussion of China than linked. Shows up everywhere, and it can mean absolutely anything, but the inference is always quite clear, isn't it? Okay, look, we're running out of time, but I do want to ask all the panelists a forward-looking question. Mike, so I might start off with you, if you don't mind. Again, a business-focused question. When you talk to businesses, are they expecting these economic punishments being dished out to get worse? Or is there some quiet confidence that perhaps China might recognise that its international reputation is really taking a hit at the moment, and backing off might actually be a good idea? Or alternatively, might Biden come to save us and put some pressure on China to help out our exporters? What are you hearing from the business community?
I don't think anyone's anywhere near as optimistic as your question sort of suggests. I think everyone's pretty pessimistic. I mean, I think, the talk in the business community now is all about diversification. Everyone's madly running around looking for new markets. And I think the Australian government's telling businesses, you've got to go and find some new markets, but that's obviously problematic because you just can't replace China. It's impossible. I mean, India's not going to do it. It's a very difficult problem. And the mood at the moment seems to be, I mean, I think the most people are hoping for is that there's not going to be any more tariffs or more restrictions, and things might cool down a bit. And I mean, I think since Christmas, there hasn't been any dramatic announcements, and maybe with Biden in the White House, the rhetoric's all going to die down. But I don't think China's suddenly going to back down at all. And I mean, the Commerce Ministry yesterday, Vice Premier Wang made some comments which indicated that, the ball's in Australia's court. We've got to get our act together, and I just can't see either side backing down at the moment. So, I think people say they're expecting things to be quite grim for another couple of years, but it's impossible to predict. So I think the business community is in a tough situation. I mean, you talk to sort of a lot of business people. I mean, they've sort of, in terms of sort of coming out and criticising the Morrison government and getting angry about what's happened. I mean, you sort of had people like Kerry Stokes and Andrew Forrest being very vocal sort of back earlier last year, but they've sort of really toned down at the moment. And the feedback, because I mean, I'm always ringing business people and CEOs that are trying to get them to talk about this issue. And they're saying, look, it's not worth our while. It's not in our self-interest, because the debate has become so polarized. If they say anything sort of slightly positive about China or negative about how Morrison's handled it, they're going to sort of be shouted down and accused of being greedy.
Yes.
So they're just not really saying anything. But off the record, they're not very happy. They're a bit frustrated. They're not happy with China, but they're also a bit frustrated with a few decisions that came out of, particularly the way the call for the coronavirus inquiry was handled. So there's a lot of frustration, but you're just not seeing it vocalised at the moment.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Richard, a forward-looking geopolitical question for you. Sorry to focus the geopolitics on you. I don't mean to single you out in that way, but you're probably best positioned to comment on it. Look, the Australian government's official position on this, Mike just said, China says it's all our fault. Well, to quote Scott Morrison, Australia has done nothing to injure the China partnership, nothing at all. Well, in that case, it's all China's fault. The Prime Minister also says that his government is exercising, quote, strategic patience, unquote, and waiting for a new, quote, settling point, unquote, one in which there is a, quote, happy coexistence. Richard, that might be nice, but I don't quite understand what that means. So can you elaborate on that for us? What does it mean in practice? And is it realistic? What if China just isn't willing to play ball? Now, clearly I'm not suggesting the Australian government, should capitulate, but do you sense is there any flexibility in the Australian government's approach that it might seek to accommodate in some way some of China's grievances to signal that it would like to change the trajectory of the bilateral relationship? Or instead, do you think, no, what we're going to see is a further doubling down?
Look, I think there's still plenty of room for tactical calibration, and I think the government is quite conscious that the economic cost is mounting, and I think it's probably not anxious to pour gasoline on the fire if it can possibly help it. But it's not easy to know which of the so-called Chinese grievances that Australia could respond to. If you accept that the list of grievances is the one that came out of the Chinese embassy, the 15 or whatever the number was, and you work your way down that list, it's pretty hard to see how Australia can fundamentally change its position on any of those issues. I mean, essentially, what the embassy was asking Australia is to stop being Australia. So that's pretty hard, I think. And it's also important to remember that you can look at individual decisions and have a discussion about whether one or more of them might have been better managed. But it's important, I think, here to remember a couple of things. One is that much of the big policy architecture around the China relationship is bipartisan in nature. That is, it is supported by both major Australian political parties. And I think the other reason to think that, within limits, that much of this policy will endure is that, while nothing is forever, at least for the foreseeable future, we're grappling with a challenge like really we've never had probably since 1942, of a country that's not just very powerful now, but moving further and further away from Australia in the way it expresses its interests, moving further away from our own sense of values about, what we think are universal, or what are universal values embodied in the UN declarations. So that's a structural issue at its heart, and it's quite hard to solve. It'll be with us for quite a while, and it requires some quite big adjustments to our domestic economic settings, to some of our security settings, and certainly, of course, to some of our foreign policy settings. And it also, I think, requires quite a big adjustment to our mental maps about China and the China relationship, that to recognise that this is our lot for the foreseeable future, and that the old model of the relationship is no longer sustainable, and we can't go back to that. So you won't be surprised to know that I don't really see us being able to happily coexist with China. I don't think it's that kind of relationship. But, and I think there is a big but here, personally, I don't think we should be fatalistic about the relationship. I don't think that we should think that it is forever doomed to fall apart. We shouldn't give up on finding a model for the relationship in which we coexist and we manage our differences, and in which we find space to work on things that are of mutual interest importance to both sides. You know, it is still possible. It won't be easy to get there. It will be really, really hard to get there. But I'm not prepared to say right now that it's impossible, you know, because things change. Biden is different, and, you know, really we have to be wary of thinking that China itself could never change. So that's an argument for cool heads, for, you know, managing the relationship in a determined but cool-headed way, to manage it in the best possible way we can, to try where we can, as I said, to focus on those positives in the relationship, but also to recognise that there's no truly important global issue that we care about that can be solved if China is not sitting at the table. And it's very strongly in our national interest if we and others can create enough international space for that to happen.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Wanning, just if I can just have a quick comment from you before we go to our audience. It's probably not fair asking for a quick comment because it's a pretty big question. But I do want to quickly return to this issue of Chinese Australians again, forward-looking this time. I mean, how do we shift the dial on that? Because your description of how we're going before was a pretty dire one. And it's going to result in a lot of social, there's not going to be a lot of cohesion. That's the last thing we want. So
that's right. Yeah, I do think this is a very important question to discuss. Maybe it's a list of wish list. It's a wish list, but hey, as Richard said, we shouldn't give up, right? So I think if I was to come up with a list of recommendations, I would say, first of all, a few things to stop doing and a few things to start doing. But the one thing to stop doing is to stop actually treating this community, or I said the word myself, to stop treating this community as the object knowledge rather than as the producer of knowledge, right? There's a lot of funding that goes into various think tanks and research institutes to research on this community, but mostly from the point of view of gauging their security, their risk as a security, or, you know, to what extent they have been influenced by China, but not actually to see them as productive of knowledge itself, and not having them as research partners rather than just the object of investigation. And I don't think that's the right way to go. And so the other thing is that we should simply stop these people to have to choose between one China and Australia. Really, and it sounds easy, really. And we should also go beyond seeing these people as some kind of security risk. That lens is very, very narrow. And we should also stop seeing them mostly in transactional terms, that is, only as voters that to woo during the time of election, for politicians to narrowcast to them, to reach them in order to say, hey, please vote me, right? And then also, I think the most important thing is that just keep in mind that they are Australian citizens. So they are rights-bearing people, just like everybody else is. So it is really important that actually we don't politically disenfranchise them and marginalize them. And I think Jason Lee was right when he said something on one occasion. He said, we should start, we should actually, starting point is to trust the citizens, unless and until there is a case that is proven there is a problem with that, right? So I think, finally, I think we need to see more political will. You just asked questions about political will. Eric Abetz had the episode where he questioned the Chinese Australians, questioned their loyalty, basically. And I haven't seen any attempt on the part of his colleagues or the government to challenge him. And that just simply went unchallenged. And also, for instance, the acting immigration minister, Alan Tudge, then, he was making an announcement about putting in more money to fund migrant English literacy, which I think is a fantastic thing. But yet he actually couched that sort of announcement by saying some of our migrant communities are still their motherland diaspora, but we want them to become proud Australians. So obviously he was actually, operating on that kind of binary kind of assumption. So I think there needs to be more political will for real genuine change to take place.
Gee, that's a good list, Wanning. That's a really strong list. I share a lot of those views. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me is that we have laws, we understand that, we have security agencies, we understand that. So there's a system in place to make sure the security interests of Australia is protected. But what we often see is people freelancing outside that system and doubting people's loyalties, actively casting doubt on them in a way that I think is pretty darn unhelpful. Okay, look, we've got time for a few questions from our audience. I might start off in the room here tonight. Now, one of my insistences, if you've ever been to a UTS ACRI event before, is that I do insist that the first question is from a female member of our audience. Now, this is because whenever you invite questions, inevitably 10 men raise their hands. And actually what academic research has shown in the past is that when a female asks the first question, subsequent questions are actually 50-50. But if a bloke goes first, all the other questions tend to be for the bloke as well. So with that introduction, do we have any initial question? Yeah, we've got two here. I'll probably go to both. I might just start at the back and then I'll come down the front. Yeah, just up the back first.
Thank you. Geraldine Duke from the ABC, who's been thinking a lot about this lately and was asked to speak about it last Friday night at Viz Asia in at the art gallery. Look, I've been thinking about whether a useful way to go forward would be for small engagements to continue. And I was thinking of, the Port Adelaide game, the football game that's been so extraordinarily successful in Shanghai, and a book is coming out on that, I think, this week. It is an example which, I gather that has gone extremely well. Mike can talk about that more. And that's built up a real little constituency of following where presumably people can leave aside, but I'll ask you, perceived politics and get on with that, which is certainly part of Australia as we know it. The second thing was I wonder what is happening to the phenomenal Australian study centres in China. 33, I think, or is it 36? Absolutely a wonder to behold, more than any other single country in China, where, they focus on devoting whole lives to translating Patrick White, which I've always personally found particularly difficult. So, there we have another success-led, smaller scale, politics-free is what I found. I've been over there for 2 separate conferences that they put on. Couldn't we continue on with those smaller scale interactions that hopefully can avoid, I suppose that's the question I'm asking you all, can they avoid these bigger discussions where we could seed those successes in both communities? They're already set up. Why couldn't we continue like that?
Thanks, Geraldine. Look, I'm happy to hand that over to the panel. Just one quick observation from me. 2 of the Chinese academics who had their visas revoked were the directors of 2 of the largest Australian study centres in China. So that remains to see how it plays out. But look, Mike, Richard, Wanning, does anyone want to weigh in on that?
I'll jump in quickly. I went to 2 of the AFL games. Great fun. Look, it was really interesting. And Port Adelaide claimed that because of what they were doing there, they got the former Trade Minister, Steve Chobo, up to China at a very difficult time. So I think that kind of sports diplomacy helps. And yeah, definitely all these sort of people-to-people interactions certainly help. I think there's still stuff going on. There's sort of writers' festivals and what have you. And the problem, obviously, at the moment is the borders are closed and no one can go and see each other. And that's really not helping the political relationship either, but they are sort of all little things. I mean, the greatest people-to-people connections, as you well know, are Chinese tourists and students coming here, and all the relationships that have formed around that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Richard, Wanning, anything to add?
Geraldine, just on the question of China, Australian studies in China, those more than 30 centers are still going, and I see information about them recruiting new students and researchers. So, so they are really, really important assets in terms of people diplomacy and public diplomacy. As you say, these are the people who devoted their career studying Henry Lawson, Patrick White, you know, or what Li Jianjun's expertise was what was going on with the translation of Chinese, Australian left-wing writers during the 50s and the 60s, all this kind of specialized knowledge. I think these centers have done enormous sort of service to promoting this, and that's still going on. That's people-to-people goodwill is still going on. Having said that, there is a widespread sense of bemusement and confusion as what is going on in Australia. And I think there's a certain level of disillusionment as well. But on the whole, I think people who chose to study Australian, do research on Australia, very fond of Australia too, still.
Anything to add, Richard? No?
Look, I think the relationship's been built over many decades through the hard work of many people, and the connections are deep and wide. And as Mike said, you know, a lot of that still goes on, and it absolutely should go on where it can be kept and preserved. I see great value in it. It can't fix the current impasse, but I do think it holds capital for the future.
Mm. Okay, thanks. Okay, we'll have one more question from our audience, and then I'll go to an online question next. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for tonight's discussion, James, Wanning, Richard and Mike. My name is Ingrid, a student from the ANU, and I have a question for Richard, but I would also love to seek the thoughts of panelists tonight. So, Richard, I wanted to ask whether you believe that the judgments in the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, what Professor John Blaxland calls Australia's Foreign Policy Plan B, do the judgments still hold true? And what would an update read? How would that read? What would it say? Thank you, as the principal author.
Good question, Ingrid. Look, a couple of observations. I think, I suppose I would say this, but I think the white paper picked the big trends that were going to shape Australia's external environment, but it's quite clear that those trends have moved faster than we thought they might have at the time, and that our external environment has deteriorated more sharply than I think we imagined. And you know, you've seen Australian policy adjust and adapt to that. And I think if you know, I think China's a good example of that. I mean, really, there's been three parts to Australian policy on China for a while. One is thinking about the region, and that's the Indo-Pacific chapter of the white paper, which is, okay, so what is this region going to look like as American preeminence fades and China becomes more powerful? How do we create a balance of power? That was one part of the policy equation. The second part was, what are the domestic risks that we have to deal with? And the third part was, how do we build a positive relationship with China? And if you look 3 years on at those three pillars, two have gone okay, and the third one has run into a brick wall. And there are other parts of the white paper where inevitably events have moved on, you know, whether it's the trade environment or a high degree of nationalism and populism we see. Personally, I think there's value in doing a quick update, not the whole white paper again. It's a big exercise to do a whole white paper. It took us a year to do it. But the Defence Department recently did an update to their Defence White Paper, 2016 Defence White Paper, which was a more contained exercise. It really just tried to bring policy settings up to speed against that rapid rate of change. And personally, I think there's value in doing that.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, let me go to an online question now. This is from Michael Wadley. He asks, no one has mentioned the US alliance and pressure that has clearly been brought to bear under the past administration to take certain lines with China. There looks like being a continuation of that under the Biden administration, if you look at Blinken and Kurt Campbell's statements. Given what our neighbours do with China, can Australia chart its own course so that the decision is not necessarily a zero-sum one? Well, I'm open for any panellist to weigh in on that, but Richard, we're probably all looking at you.
Look, well, respectfully, Michael, I don't accept the premise of your question. Certainly from an Australian government perspective, all Australian governments are, of course, interested in the view from Washington. The alliance is a very important part of our foreign policy and defence framework, and the relationships there are, of course, incredibly close, and we talk a lot. But I don't think it's accurate to say that Australian policy on China has been driven by views from the United States. And I can tell you, even though I'm a year out now, from personal experience in thinking about how do we respond to this new challenge, this great new challenge for Australia, that foremost in our own minds was what was in Australia's national interests. And I think it's notable, in fact, that Australia was well ahead of the United States on some core policies in relation to China. Examples are 5G, the foreign interference legislation, even the thinking in the white paper about a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific favourable to our interest. All of those big policy decisions were driven in Canberra with a very strong focus on Australia's own national interests. So just being close to America, just having an alliance doesn't mean that Australia doesn't run an independent foreign policy, because we do.
Mm. Yeah, you're quite right on a number of things we were at in front. Yeah. Mike and Wanning, did either of you like to weigh in?
I'll just quickly, actually, I know Michael, he's in Shanghai. I think I owe him lunch. Right. Yeah. But no, I totally agree with Richard, and it was a constant criticism from the Chinese government when I was there that Australia was doing Donald Trump's bidding. We were the US sheriffs in the region, which I agree. I don't think that is the case, and there's a counter argument that, in fact, you know, we led the way on many policies and foreign interference, and perhaps influenced some of the decisions the US is making. So that's all I'd say on that.
One thing I would add, just to push back a little bit, is that sometimes I think we've given we haven't done ourselves any favours, and some of the statements that have been made have given an impression. If I was someone sitting in the Chinese embassy in Canberra, for example, around Maurice Payne's call for a COVID inquiry, if you listen to what Peter Dutton said a couple of days earlier, and you listen to what some of the things Prime Minister Morrison said a couple of days later, if you're already inclined to that view, which clearly Beijing is, it wouldn't be hard to put all those comments together and have that confirm your assessment. Doesn't mean you're right, but it is a factor. Look, I think we're going to have to finish up on this one. This is from Yuan Jiang from QUT. I know he's a PhD student at QUT, very active in writing commentary on Australia-China relations, which is fantastic. We want more Chinese international students engaged in this space. One thing, I'm guessing this one is probably going to be most suited to you. He asks, what do you see the role of Chinese students in bilateral relations? Are they going to be some glue that holds this together, or?
It's interesting. I see the question, the way he phrased this question is, what is the role of Chinese students in the exacerbation of bilateral relations? I thought initially it's in the improvement of the relations, which is interesting because ideally, in ideal world, international students from China should be the perfect actors to promote people-to-people diplomacy, and the perfect individuals who are here to learn and then bring the knowledge back home to China, and also introduce Australia to their friends and family in China, encourage them to study, encourage them to come here as tourists, encourage them to visit and say Australia is a friendly country, it's lovely, but they do a lot of that. I know that they do a lot of it because there was a lot of posting on the social media about that. But having said that, currently, I think the Chinese students in Australian universities have, on many occasions, been portrayed as problematic, as causing trouble, as not being able to fit in with the learning culture here, as challenging their students because they're too nationalistic. And as a result of that, there are some incidents that probably people here would remember over the last couple of years of students challenging the teachers over the issues of, you know, what they're taught about Taiwan or Hong Kong or Xinjiang. And sometimes I have to say, as an academic teaching, you know, students, we are not very well trained to deal with this kind of tension in the classroom. And as a result of that, we sometimes let go of these perfect learning opportunities where students from both Australia and China can use this occasion and discussion to learn something from each other's perspective, to develop sort of critical analytical skills about issues, and rather than just become hot-headed and then just become confrontational. And unfortunately, these students are pretty much portrayed in media as causing trouble, and as a result of that, and the Chinese students are advised from time to time by the Chinese government, you know, think again before you come to study in Australia. So I think, you know, they do now become, they're caught up, I think, in a relationship. But ideally, it shouldn't have to be the case.
Yeah, as someone also has taught a lot of Chinese students before, I mean, admittedly it's in economics, it's perhaps not the most contentious area, but my experience with them has been they're wonderful students.
You'll be very surprised that sort of controversy can arrive from engineering classes.
Yeah, okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, look, I did actually have a final question for the panellists, but it related to their predictions looking forward in the year of the ox. And Mike, Richard, Wanning, I think I'm pretty safe to speak for you in saying that we're probably in for a pretty tough year ahead. Would that be right, Mike?
I think so. Hopefully not as tough as last year, surely, but it's not going to be easy. No.
Are you crossing your fingers there, Mike? Okay. Richard, challenging times ahead?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, that old joke, never make predictions, especially about the future. So things change so rapidly, it's hard to be certain about anything. But, you know, I think, it's hard to see a quick recovery in the relationship.
Wanning?
Well, still wearing a hat as a media studies academic, I would say that stories are going to change from day to day, different actors and different plot, but the narrative framework's already predetermined.
Right. It's a strong comment to finish off on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed tonight's event. It was very broad-ranging, as you saw. I particularly want to thank our panellists, Wanning, Richard Maude and Mike Smith. As you saw, they're extremely good in their areas. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Let's thank them. If I can give a quick plug for ACRI's next event, this is in March. I think you'll like this one. It's related to the media, and it's called According to Sources. And we've got Anthony Galloway, who's the national security reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald, joining us with Monica Attard, who's the head of the School of Journalism at UTS, to talk about this. It's certainly the case that since 2017, Australia's China discussion has become more securitised. Media's played a key role in that. So it's going to be great to get a practitioner like Anthony along. And Monica also has a practitioner background, but she's an academic today. So I hope you can join us for that event next month as well. Thank you, everyone.